If you're over 55, I want you to listen to me very closely for the next few minutes. I want to talk about your money, the money you've worked for your entire life, the money you've been responsible with, the money you're counting on for a secure and dignified retirement. You're probably a lot like a woman I know named Margaret. At 62, she was the picture of financial responsibility. She owned her home outright. She had a decent retirement fund. She was a spreadsheet queen, a coupon clipper, the person her friends came to for financial advice. But one morning, she sat down at her kitchen table, looked at her bank statement, and felt a wave of cold panic. The numbers didn't make sense. She had spent nearly $10,000 more in the last year than she had budgeted for. Not on a vacation, not on a new car, not on anything she could point to. It had just vanished. Have you ever felt that? That sinking feeling that your money is slipping through your fingers, but you can't figure out how? If you have, you are not alone. And it is not your fault. What Margaret discovered that day is something that is happening to millions of seniors all across the country. It's a silent financial drain, a series of small, seemingly insignificant expenses that are secretly costing you a fortune. Today, I'm going to reveal the 5 biggest culprits. I'm going to show you exactly how these costs creep into your life, why they are so hard to spot, and how you can reclaim that $10,000 a year. Margaret's journey started when she decided to become a detective of her own finances. She spread a year's worth of receipts and bank statements across her dining room table like pieces of a puzzle. And slowly, 5 distinct patterns began to emerge. 5 patterns that were quietly derailing her retirement. The first category she uncovered was the hidden health cost. Now, Margaret thought she had a good handle on her medical expenses. She was on Medicare. She took just a couple of common prescription drugs for blood pressure and cholesterol. She budgeted about $1,500 a year for her copays and other costs, which seemed reasonable. But when she painstakingly tallied up every single pharmacy receipt, the real total was over $2,800. A shocking $1,300 more than she'd planned for. How? It wasn't in the big things, it was in the small additions. The ones nobody warns you about. It was the over-the-counter supplements her doctor casually mentioned might be beneficial at her age. It was the name-brand version of a drug her doctor insisted on when the generic didn't seem to be working as well. It was the emergency refill she had to pay full price for while visiting her sister out of state. Let's break it down, because this is where it gets insidious. There were the vitamin D tablets her doctor said might help with energy levels. That's $18 a month. There was the glucosamine her neighbor swore by for joint health, another $24 a month. And there was the probiotic supplement that the pharmacy display promised would boost immunity for seniors. That was $32 for a bottle that didn't even last a full month. Do you see the psychology here? None of these purchases felt irresponsible. In fact, they felt like the opposite. They felt like wise investments in her health and longevity. $18 to feel more energetic? Of course. $32 to improve your immune system? A bargain. But these small, wise decisions were accumulating like compound interest, silently adding over $1,000 to her annual expenses. The second secret expense was what I call technology creep. Margaret considered herself reasonably tech-savvy. She had a smartphone to video chat with her grandkids, a laptop, and basic internet. Nothing fancy. But when she pulled out the bills, she saw a different story. Her cell phone plan, which she thought was $55 a month, was now costing $78. When she spent 40 minutes on hold to find out why, she learned her promotional rate had expired. They had also added phone insurance she vaguely remembered discussing, and a convenience fee for paying her bill online. Her home internet bill had a similar story. It had somehow jumped from $39 a month to $67. Why? Because a technician who came for a service call 6 months ago had recommended an upgrade, mentioning she'd be able to see her grandchildren's faces more clearly on video calls. At the time, an extra $28 a month to see her family better had felt like a no-brainer. But that no-brainer was an extra $336 a year. When she added that to the creep in her cell phone bill, she was looking at nearly $700 in extra technology costs. And then there were the subscriptions. Margaret prided herself on being careful, not just mindlessly signing up for things. But careful is more complicated than it used to be. There was the streaming service she signed up for with a free trial to watch one show her daughter recommended. She meant to cancel, but then her book club started talking about a different show on the same platform. That's $12.99 a month that became permanent. There was the cloud storage for her photos. It started at $2 a month. But after a family trip, she needed more space. The upgrade to the $9.99 family plan seemed temporary, but she never got around to downgrading. There was the meditation app her doctor suggested for stress, just $4.99 a month. The online fitness program for seniors her physical therapist mentioned, another $14 a month. The password manager the computer guy insisted was essential for someone your age, a seemingly small $36 a year. Again, look at the pattern. Every single one of these expenses was presented as a smart, responsible choice, an investment in her health, her safety, her connection to family. And in isolation, they were. But together, they added up to over $1,500 a year in small, recurring charges she had never consciously budgeted for. As Margaret stood up to make a cup of tea, her hands were shaking. She was starting to see a disturbing picture. It seemed like the very systems designed to help seniors stay healthy, connected, and safe were also quietly and systematically draining their fixed incomes. And she was just getting started. The third category that emerged from her financial archaeology was what she came to think of as convenience costs. The small fees and charges that had gradually increased as she'd made reasonable adjustments to her lifestyle as she aged. Margaret had always been independent and self-sufficient, but at 62 she'd begun making small concessions to practicality and safety. She'd started having her groceries delivered occasionally when the weather was bad, or when she was feeling particularly tired. She'd begun using ride-sharing services instead of driving in heavy traffic or at night. She'd started paying for premium services at businesses she frequented to avoid long waits or confusing processes. Each of these decisions made perfect sense in isolation. Her family had actually encouraged many of them, worried about her safety and well-being. But as she tallied up the costs, another pattern emerged. Grocery delivery fees averaged $6 per order plus tip. She'd been using the service roughly twice per month, thinking of it as an occasional convenience. But $24 per month added up to nearly $300 per year, money that could have stayed in her pocket if she'd continued shopping in person. The ride-sharing services were even more significant. Margaret had always been a confident driver, but nighttime driving had become more stressful. Using ride-sharing for these occasions seemed like a reasonable safety measure. But the rides that cost $8 to $12 each during the day became $15 to $25 in the evening, especially if surge pricing was in effect. What she'd estimated as $40 per month for occasional rides had actually averaged closer to $87 a month, over $1,000 per year. The premium service fees were perhaps the most insidious, because they were often presented as special offers for seniors. The bank had offered her a premium account that would eliminate ATM fees and provide identity theft monitoring for just $12 per month. It seemed like a good deal. The pharmacy had enrolled her in their premium wellness program for $21 per month. Her car insurance company had convinced her to add roadside assistance for an additional $48 per month for peace of mind. The pattern continued across multiple aspects of her life. Premium customer service for her utilities that guaranteed shorter wait times for $15 monthly. Enhanced identity monitoring services for $19 monthly. Extended warranties on appliances presented as especially important for people on fixed incomes. Each premium service had been marketed to her in the context of her age and situation. By Margaret's calculation, these convenience and premium service costs were adding up to over $2,200 per year. Money that was ostensibly making her life easier and safer, but that was also quietly eroding her financial security. The fourth category she uncovered was perhaps the most emotionally difficult to confront, what she came to call guilt and generosity expenses. As she sorted through her credit card statements, Margaret began to notice a pattern of spending that she'd never really examined closely. Small gifts, contributions, and donations that had seemed appropriate in the moment, but, when added together, represented a significant drain. There were the birthday gifts for her grandchildren that had grown more elaborate over the years, now exceeding $100 each. With 4 grandchildren, special occasions were adding up to over $1,500 per year. Then there were the charitable contributions. The requests arrived weekly, each seeming urgent and important. The suggested donation amounts were usually modest, $15, $25, occasionally $50. Margaret considered herself thoughtful, but when she added up all the small donations, the total was staggering, over $2,000 in contributions, none of which she'd budgeted for. The pattern extended to her relationships. As her social circle faced more challenges, Margaret found herself quietly helping in small ways, picking up the check more often, contributing extra for group gifts, offering to pay for small expenses when traveling with her sister. There were the subscription boxes she'd purchased as gifts, running at over $100 a month for 3 recipients. She'd also discovered that many of the services she dealt with had learned to leverage her generosity. The grocery delivery service regularly asked if she'd like to add a donation to the local food bank. The ride-sharing app offered an option to round up her fare. Her utility company provided an option to contribute to help low-income families. None of these individual contributions was significant, but they appeared on nearly every transaction. $2 here, $3 there. By Margaret's calculation, these micro-donations alone were adding up to over $400 annually. The emotional weight of this category was heavier than the financial impact. Margaret realized she was being marketed to as someone with both disposable income and a heightened sense of social responsibility. The assumption seemed to be that seniors had time and money to be generous, and that generosity was expected of them. The fifth and final category Margaret identified was what she called maintenance and replacement costs, the expenses associated with keeping her home and lifestyle functioning as she aged. At 62, Margaret was still healthy, but she'd begun to notice that maintaining the same standard of living required more frequent interventions. Her home maintenance costs had crept upward as she'd begun hiring professionals for tasks she used to do herself: cleaning the gutters, pressure, washing the deck, deep cleaning carpets, seasonal yard work. Each service call seemed reasonable in isolation, but these routine tasks were now costing her over $800 annually. Her personal care expenses had similarly escalated: a monthly massage for back pain, professional hair coloring, regular manicures, services that made her feel more confident and put together. These weren't vanity expenses in her mind. They were investments in feeling capable, but they represented over $1,500 per year that hadn't been part of her budget when she was younger. The replacement costs were even more significant. As her appliances aged, she'd begun to notice that the replacement options marketed to seniors were often more expensive. The new television she'd purchased came with larger buttons on the remote and enhanced audio for $300 more than a basic model. The new washing machine was marketed as a senior-friendly model, with a front-loading design to reduce bending, for a premium of nearly $400. Even smaller purchases followed this pattern: ergonomic kitchen tools, a lightweight vacuum, comfort bedding, all marketed to seniors at a significant premium. Margaret realized that there was an entire economy built around the assumption that older adults were willing to pay more for products positioned as being specifically designed for their needs. These maintenance and replacement costs were adding up to over $2,500 annually beyond what she'd budgeted. As Margaret finished her financial archaeology project, she sat surrounded by stacks of receipts and bank statements. The numbers were undeniable. 5 categories of expenses that had each seemed reasonable individually had combined to create a financial drain of nearly $10,000 per year beyond her budget. Medication and health-related costs had become $2,800. Technology and subscriptions were over $1,800. Convenience fees and premium services had added over $2,200. Generosity and guilt-driven expenses had totaled over $2,000. And maintenance and replacement costs had exceeded her budget by $2,500. $10,000. Nearly $1,000 per month, money that could have funded the travel she'd dreamed of, the photography classes she'd wanted to take, the move closer to her grandchildren she'd been considering. But more than the financial impact, Margaret was shaken by the realization of how systematically these costs had been introduced into her life. The pattern she saw was more insidious than outright fraud. It was a complex ecosystem of businesses, service providers, and marketers who had identified older adults as a demographic willing to pay premium prices for products and services, positioned as being relevant to their life stage, health concerns, or desire for convenience. The marketing was sophisticated, leveraging her concerns about staying healthy, independent, and generous. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her daughter Sarah, calling to confirm their lunch plans. "Hi, Mom, just wanted to make sure we're still on for tomorrow. I'm so excited to hear about your retirement plan. Dad always said you were the smartest person he knew with money, so I'm sure you've got everything figured out perfect." Margaret felt a stab of emotion at the mention of her late husband, David. He had indeed trusted her financial judgment completely, and she'd always prided herself on living up to that trust. The idea that she'd somehow lost control of their carefully managed resources felt like a betrayal of his memory. "Of course we're still on," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady, "though I might have some different things to share with you than I originally planned." After she hung up, Margaret felt angry, but she also felt empowered. Understanding the problem was the first step towards solving it. The next day at lunch, Sarah was surprised when her mother pulled out a folder full of documents. "Mom, this looks serious. Is everything okay?" Margaret smiled. "Everything is going to be fine, but I need to tell you about something I've discovered." Over the next hour, Margaret walked Sarah through her findings. Sarah listened with growing amazement. "Mom, I had no idea. When you put it all together like this, it's really shocking. But also, every individual expense you're describing sounds completely reasonable. I probably would have made the same decisions." "That's exactly the problem," Margaret said. Each decision was reasonable in isolation, but together they were undermining everything. Margaret told Sarah about her plan to systematically address each category of expense. She was going to audit her medication costs, review all her technology services, evaluate each convenience service, set a specific budget for generosity, and research purchases more carefully to avoid paying premium prices. "But more than that," Margaret said, "I think other people need to know about this. There are thousands of seniors experiencing the same thing." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Mom. It's not just about the money. It's about maintaining independence and security." Over the following weeks, Margaret implemented her plan with characteristic determination. The results were dramatic. By working with her pharmacist to find generic alternatives and questioning each supplement, she reduced her annual medication costs by over $1,200. She called every service provider and subscription company, dropping her technology costs by another $1,200 a year. The convenience fees and premium services were evaluated, and she kept only those that truly made her life significantly easier, saving $1,300 per year. Setting a budget for charitable and gift-giving was liberating, saving her over $1,500 annually. In total, Margaret's systematic review resulted in annual savings of over $5,500, but the financial benefits were only part of the impact. Margaret discovered that understanding and controlling these expenses had given her a sense of agency and confidence. She was back in control. More importantly, she'd become passionate about helping others avoid the same trap. Margaret began giving presentations at senior centers and community groups. She called her presentation, "The Hidden Costs of Aging: How Small Expenses Silently Drain Senior Finances," and the response was overwhelming. At her first presentation, over 60 people showed up. "I thought I was the only one experiencing this," said Robert, a 70-year-old retired teacher. "The scary thing," added Patricia, a 68-year-old widow, "is how good the marketing is. They make you feel like you're being irresponsible if you don't sign up." Margaret's presentation evolved. She developed specific strategies for each of the 5 expense categories and began to uncover additional patterns other seniors were experiencing. One recurring theme was fear-based selling, marketing products by emphasizing the risks of aging and positioning expensive solutions as necessary protect. "They told me that identity theft was especially dangerous for seniors," explained Harold, a 73-year-old retired engineer. "So I signed up for 3 different identity monitoring services. I was spending over $200 per month on protection from crimes that statistically are no more likely to happen to me than to anyone else." Another pattern was complexity pricing, charging seniors extra for simplified versions of products. "The insurance agent convinced me that I needed a special senior-focused policy that would be easier to understand," shared Dorothy, a 65-year-old retired nurse. "It cost 40% more than a standard policy with identical coverage." Margaret began to see that the issue was part of a much larger phenomenon. There was an entire segment of the economy built on the assumption that seniors would pay premium prices for products positioned as being specifically designed for their needs. Some of these products provided genuine value, but many were simply standard offerings with minor modifications sold at significantly higher prices. Her work caught the attention of local media and financial advisors, but the most meaningful feedback came from the seniors who attended her presentations. "Margaret, I followed your advice and audited my expenses," wrote Eleanor, a 71-year-old retired librarian. "I was spending almost $8,000 per year on small expenses I hadn't even realized were accumulating. I've already cut that down to less than $3,000, and I feel like I have my financial life back under control." Margaret's work began to evolve beyond just identifying the problem. She started developing comprehensive resources to help seniors navigate the complex landscape of age-related marketing. She created checklists, scripts for negotiating with service providers, and guides for researching major purchases. Most importantly, she began to advocate for greater awareness and regulation of marketing practices that specifically targeted older adults. Her story reached a national audience when a personal finance blogger wrote about her work. She began receiving emails from seniors in other states experiencing similar patterns. Her work caught the attention of research. She learned that economists had identified senior-targeted financial exploitation as a growing concern. But most research had focused on obvious scams rather than the more subtle forms of systematic overcharging she'd documented. Your work is incredibly important because you've identified patterns that are perfectly legal but are still having a significant negative impact, explained Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a researcher at a prominent university. The companies involved aren't breaking any laws, but they are systematically exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. Dr. Rodriguez invited Margaret to collaborate on a more comprehensive study. Together, they surveyed over 500 seniors. The results were staggering. Nearly 73% of respondents were spending significantly more than they'd budgeted on small, recurring expenses marketed to their age group. The average annual overspending was over $8,400 per person. Most were unaware of the extent of their overspending, experiencing what the researchers termed stealth inflation. The study also revealed that seniors were particularly vulnerable because they were targeted with marketing messages that leveraged their concerns about health, safety, and independence. The psychological manipulation is quite sophisticated, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Seniors are presented with choices that make declining additional services seem irresponsible. Armed with this research, Margaret's advocacy work took on new dimensions. She began working with consumer protection organizations, consulting with financial advisors, and working with senior advocacy groups to push for better disclosure requirements. What had started as personal confusion had evolved into a mission. But the most profound transformation was personal. Margaret had discovered that taking control had restored her sense of agency and competence in a world that often seemed designed to make older adults feel vulnerable. I realized that what was really happening wasn't just financial, Margaret explained at a national conference on aging. It was psychological. These marketing practices were making me feel like I needed to pay extra to remain safe, healthy, and independent as I got older. They were monetizing my fears about aging. The real threat to my independence wasn't aging. It was the systematic erosion of my financial resources. Margaret began to develop what she called the 5 pillars of senior financial defense. The first pillar was medical cost vigilance, teaching seniors to carefully evaluate every health-related expense. The second was technology and subscription audit, a systematic process for reviewing all recurring expenses every 6 months. The third was convenience cost analysis, evaluating whether premium services provided genuine value. The fourth pillar was generosity budgeting, advocating for conscious, planned generosity based on personal values rather than emotional manipulation. The fifth was premium product skepticism, developing guidelines for evaluating whether products marketed specifically to seniors were worth their premium pricing. Her 5-pillar approach began to gain traction. But the most meaningful validation came from the seniors who implemented her strategies. I followed your 5-pillar approach and saved over $7,000 in the first year, wrote Helen from Arizona. But more than the money, I feel like myself again. I feel competent and in control. Your work helped me understand that being old doesn't mean being a target, wrote George from New York. 3 years after her discovery, Margaret was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on aging. Senators, the issue I'm here to discuss affects millions of American seniors, she began. It's not dramatic fraud or obvious scams. It's the systematic exploitation of legitimate concerns about aging. She walked them through her research, explaining how the 5 categories of hidden expenses were affecting seniors. Mrs. Chen, what you're describing sounds like a form of economic discrimination against older adults, observed Senator Patricia Williams, the subcommittee chair. Are you suggesting that seniors are being charged more simply because of their age? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Senator, Margaret replied. Her congressional testimony sparked national media attention. But for Margaret, the most meaningful outcome was the restored sense of confidence she'd gained. I got my power back, she explained to Sarah. I went from feeling confused and helpless to understanding exactly where my money was going. Sarah smiled. Dad would be so proud of you, Mom. Not just because you saved money, but because you turned your personal struggle into something that's helping thousands of other people. Margaret nodded. I think he'd be relieved to know that I didn't let those companies take advantage of me without fighting back. As Margaret looked back, she realized the most important lesson wasn't about money management, It was about maintaining agency and self-respect in a society that often treats aging as a process of decline. The real threat to independence as we age isn't physical or cognitive decline, she had come to understand. It's the assumption that we need to pay extra for protection because we're no longer capable of managing in the regular world. Once you reject that assumption, you can protect yourself. On a quiet Sunday morning, 4 years after her original discovery, Margaret sat reviewing her bank statements with satisfaction. The money she'd saved had funded her dreams. She'd taken photography classes, traveled, and was planning a move to be closer to her family. Her advocacy work had become a second career. Her phone rang. It was a producer from a national television program who wanted to feature her story. "Mrs. Chen," the producer said, "we think your story could help millions of seniors." Margaret smiled. "Of course, but I want to make sure the focus is on empowering seniors to be savvy consumers, not on portraying them as victims. The most important message is that people don't become less capable of making good financial decisions just because they get older." Margaret's story was ultimately about more than money. It was about the possibility of aging with dignity, agency, and purpose. It was about refusing to accept that getting older meant becoming an easy target. Most importantly, it was about the recognition that the wisdom and experience that come with age can be powerful tools for protecting oneself and helping others. The hidden costs of aging, Margaret had learned, were not inevitable. They were choices that seniors could make consciously and strategically. And making those choices consciously was the key to maintaining both financial security and personal agency throughout the aging process. The most expensive cost of aging wasn't any particular product or service. It was the assumption that aging meant accepting vulnerability. Once that assumption was rejected, seniors could reclaim their power as informed, capable consumers who deserved fair treatment and honest pricing at any age. That lesson, Margaret believed, was worth far more than the $10,000 she'd saved. It was a lesson that could transform how an entire generation approached the financial challenges and opportunities of aging in America.